Welcome to the first ever episode of Solutions. I'm Elias,
And I'm Grant.
and we've got a great episode planned for you today. We're going to be talking about one of the biggest issues facing our country, that is likely to become even more of a problem very soon, and that is homelessness. On any given night, there are 567,715 people who are without permanent housing, 211,000 of which are on the street without shelter. Now, in my opinion, it is embarrassing to live in a country with such exorbitant wealth that still allows so many of its citizens to suffer. I shouldn't need to give too big of an explanation about how big of a problem this is. It's something that many of us see every day, especially those of us who live closer to the inner cities. And there are a few measures in which the problem has gotten better. There are a few measures in which the problem has gotten worse. Overall, homelessness has been decreasing slightly, but in places like LA, the number has actually doubled over the past decade. And so my hope is that in this episode, we can give you all a better idea, a better understanding of what we can pragmatically do in our lives as voters, as communities, etc., to finally put an end to this crisis. So, to give sort of an introduction as to what this podcast is about and how we're going to be approaching it, Grant and I will be hosting every episode together, and we've spent about a month ish compiling research separately in our free time about how we might propose tackling this issue. So we've each come up with one or more solutions, which might be based in policy, cultural shifts, philanthropy, volunteering, whatever we think is going to be effective and solve this problem. During the episode, we'll hear each other out. We'll see where we landed on everything and how much we're in agreement or disagreement, maybe talk about potential caveats or obstacles. And hopefully at the end, we'll provide some tangible ways that you, the listener, can help solve this issue. So I'll kick it off with you, Grant. What did you discover in your research? How would you tackle this problem?
All right. So mainly the policy that I would be a strong advocate for to sort of curb the homelessness problem would be a housing first program, wherein we provide housing to people that need it with very little or no sort of requirements, or they don't have to meet any sort of arbitrary expectations. And then coupling that with additional therapy and potentially aid with addiction, because that's also a problem that's statistically higher amongst the homeless population.
Awesome. I came up with a few different solutions and a few different angles to tackle the problem with, and housing first was definitely a big aspect of my solution as well. And it seems what's cool about it is this is actually something that the U.S. and Europe have been like slowly kind of shifting towards over the past few years, and it's proven to be very effective in pretty much everywhere it's been tried. We don't have like decades of data on it yet, but I know that in Finland they've almost eradicated homelessness thanks to this solution, and especially in cities where there are more problems with addiction and there are more obstacles, mental health obstacles, and things like that that people might have. People experiencing homelessness tend to function better when they have a house, when they have privacy and security and all that. So that's sort of what this housing first program is based on, as opposed to like a staircase model where you would expect them to figure out some aspect of their lives before being considered, quote unquote, ready for a house or something like that. Housing first is basically you get the house, and then we also simultaneously provide you with, whatever resources you might need. So, so it's cool. It sounds like we're off on a good start because we kind of agree on the first aspect of the solution.
Absolutely. And I think that comparing it to sort of the status quo, I know we started like this is the one kind of evidence that or research that we shared was based on what it costs now in terms of hospitalizing and doing incarceration, emergency room fees. I think that was the Vox article that we looked over, where it costs like $31,000 per year, based on data from Central Florida, versus like housing first would cost 10,000 per year. And then there was another study looking at LA County, where the county saved 20% by putting people with complex mental health issues in support of housing rather than relying on just like law enforcement and emergency room visits. So it's sort of like it's really I think of it as kind of an investment, really. You know, you're going to provide a housing, which a lot of people, I think their initial reaction to that proposal is going to be like, oh, it's going to cost so much. We're not going to be able to do it. It's unrealistic. When in actuality, it's actually cheaper than the consequences of not doing anything about the homeless problem and just leaving the social systems as they stand to sort of correct this problem that they're not designed to actually provide any sort of permanent fix to, or any fix really, because housing first isn't a permanent fix in of itself. Homelessness still exists where there are like housing first programs, but we can get into that later.
Yeah, for sure. And you're absolutely right about the costs. I think part of what helped to popularize this strategy over recent years was a study that came out by the what was it called? It was by Nithya Raman, who's now on city council as of this recent election. She was working for the city in 2014 and put out a report where LA had spent, was it 100 million like a year or over time or something like that, but like 90% of that money was just going towards putting people in jail, and that was, like, the budget for solving homelessness was just basically, like, rounding people up on the streets, and that sort of raised a lot of people's, awareness and opened a lot of people's eyes about, how ineffective the spending has been so far on this. So since then, there's been a little bit more of an effort on housing first and just helping people. And in 2016, they passed Proposition HHH, which passed by I think like 77%, which is a huge for a bill being passed, or a proposition, so to speak. Which basically allocated $1.2 billion dollars in general obligation funds to partially subsidize the construction of up to 10,000 units of supportive housing. And they've been kind of slow with that goal. And so, we can talk in a little bit about like sort of some of the obstacles that come up when you build housing in large cities. Um, and I think by now there are just only three of the developments are actually ready to house people. And this is something they've been working on for the past 4 years. So we can go into that actually as sort of a stepping stone. Let's talk about some of the problems that come up when we try to build homes and when we try to provide houses for people. So one thing that I saw as a constant pattern when researching this is that the zoning laws in a lot of these big cities don't really account for the population growth and the demographics of these cities. So, for example, in Los Angeles and in I believe in New York as well, the most of the city is zoned for single family houses. Which doesn't help these people who are lower income, doesn't help people who might benefit from programs like this because it's cheaper to put them in apartments, and there's such a low quantity of apartments, which means low supply, which means they end up costing more, and there's not enough to go around for everyone. So that would sort of be another aspect, in my opinion, to the solution for this would be to fix the zoning laws. This is something that a lot of advocacy groups and politicians have been trying to look into. They have a new sort of plan as to how we're going to, or how Los Angeles is going to start redefining some of their zones, but there hasn't been really enough progress on that. In fact, the zoning code in Los Angeles hasn't changed since 1946. So that would be another aspect, is to change the zoning laws, so that we can actually support more um, apartments and more lower income housing.
Absolutely. I don't know a whole lot about the zoning law thing, so I think that makes sense, that it would be more of like a, systemic issue rather than something, malicious, is something that I found to be kinda more true. What I was kind of looking at was, the sort of cultural attitudes that a lot of people have about, not wanting, like, low, or, like, subsidized housing near them, sort of like the NIMBY "not in my
Mhm.
backyard" attitude.
Yeah.
But it actually turns out that a lot of those, attitudes, aren't necessarily based in any evidence, and there's actually evidence, to sort of counter that narrative. So There was a Stanford study, sort of addressing a lot of the not in my backyard, people who are concerned that developing and building low income or inexpensive or free quote unquote housing near them will decrease their property values. Um, Showed that most of the effects that are sort of felt are pretty minuscule. They happen within a tenth of a mile of wherever these projects or housing developments are built. And as it turns out, it's typically wealthier neighborhoods that are more adversely affected, but it's only by like 2.5% within one tenth of a mile of whatever is being developed to provide housing. So it's really not a whole lot of an issue necessarily. Um, and then in lower income areas, it actually increases the property value by 6.5%, is what this study found. And the study also found that there was no real effect on the crime rate either. So, sort of another sort of cultural opinion of people, they think, we're going to have all these quote unquote like homeless, houseless people near us, oh, think of the crime. It's not necessarily based in any kind of reality. Um, and I wasn't able to find any study that indicated that these housing developments would adversely affect either general real estate trends or the crime rates in whatever area they're being developed in. I also have another analysis that looks at a 10-year period from 1996 to 2006, the 20 lowest or the property values in the 20 least affordable housing markets. And there was only really an effect in Boston and Cambridge, but it's again very minuscule effects on the overall like cost of real estate or whatever.
Interesting. I do know that, when you tend to build more housing, property values tend to decrease, so it'd be understandable for certain neighborhoods why that would be, basically, the people who might be affected by that are property owners, and it's I believe that, it's something that we kind of have to balance whenever we think about policy is, like, who is gonna be affected by what, and to me, I would prioritize, even if that was a given, which it sounds like from the studies you cited, it's not even a given, but even if it was, we have to think about what we as a society are sort of, prioritizing, which, hopefully in this case would be getting people on their feet, getting people, out of shelters and out of the streets and things like that, is probably more important than whether or not you'll be able to sell your house, in a few years for the biggest amount possible. Um, but I'm glad that you brought up the cultural aspect because that's kind of something I want to zoom in on a little bit more. Whenever we think about policy, in order for we can talk about all day about what policies we want passed, but ultimately, the voters have to be the ones to implement them. So when I think about public attitudes towards homelessness, I actually watched an interesting TED talk about this where someone was talking about the fact that we look down on so many homeless people and we see them, it's kind of the cyclical problem where, the problem gets worse and then we see homeless individuals, people experiencing homelessness as these like drug addicts who are just like screaming at people and they don't even want help and they're crazy and all this stuff. And I think that, for reasons that should be evident, but we'll discuss them as well. This is really not the attitude that we want to have. And I think people know that on a surface level, but it's worth sort of analyzing why that happens and challenging ourselves to have a better outlook on this because if we want to solve this as a community, then we're going to have to look at each individual as a human being who is just as deserving of respect as anyone else. And in addition to this, one thing that kind of ties into this is doing community outreach, which is sort of one of the other solutions that I had in my list of things that we can be doing. I looked into a number of organizations that provide services for the homeless that bring them food and hand warmers and COVID masks and hygiene kits and things like that. And I think just in general, doing any sort of you know broad outreach or even just stopping to have a conversation with someone who is on the streets who approaches you or something like that, or who you approach, can go a long way towards humanizing these people and helping them feel like they are recognized, like they're part of the community. And when we think about like all these laws and policies that are going to go in place, that are planning on building these houses and providing vouchers and things like that, we start to get a little bit detached from the people that we're actually helping, and that can drive a further wedge between, us and them, which we don't want there to be that wedge. We want to embrace everyone as, as a community, and that's sort of how we're going to make progress with this issue, especially, in the short term and the long term, because some of these things take a while to get passed as well.
Absolutely. I think that kind of going off of what you were talking about. I think that there is sort of a fear of the homeless. Like, it's something I've encountered in my personal life where people are like, kind of what you were saying. Like, they have this perception that they are all, like scary, screaming drug addicts or whatever, and that's just it goes a long way in dehumanizing what's ultimately just like people who don't have somewhere to be, and they're not really any different from anyone else. It's just that they are in a really difficult socioeconomic position. There was a study conducted by two guys named Scott Clifford and Spencer Pittston. They published their work in the Washington Post. Again, I'm repping for the Washington Post this episode, I guess. And they conducted a national survey of 861 adults, and they asked like sort of what policies they would support regarding the homeless. And with this sample, they found that both of them would have supported like financial aid and subsidized housing, but on the other hand, supported bans on things like panhandling and sleeping in public and that sort of thing. And it sort of stems from just a sense of disgust that a lot of people have from homelessness, because things like panhandling and sleeping outside, that's when people actually see the homeless, right?
Right.
Or people without housing. Um, so it's like it's more of an immediate thing for them. But if they advocate, just sort of ethereally, like, oh yeah, public housing, like a lot of people tend to be more in favor of that.
Part of when I was doing my research, I found this YouTube channel, which it's pretty popular, so some people might have heard of it. Maybe you've heard of it, but it's called Invisible People.
Haven't heard of it.
Um, And so basically what Invisible People does, they're like a organization, that basically like has discussions with people who are experiencing homelessness, and broadcasts a lot of these discussions on their YouTube channel. And they also advocate for certain policies, and they help people organize to write their representatives about these policies and things like that. And I've found that when I was watching these videos and hearing about people's experiences, I almost felt like that was teaching me more than when I was looking at studies and policies and graphs about this sort of thing, because I mean, this type of issue and these types of experiences are so nuanced, and there's just so much more to it than a simple fact sheet or a simple chart. The fact that a lot of these people can't wash their hands, which we're all supposed to do right now frequently because of COVID. And so there was a huge worry about a lot of these individuals getting diseases and things like that. Um, and there's just a lot of things that you don't really think about until you have either talked with one of these people or seen a discussion with them. And I think that exposing ourselves to that can really go a long way towards empathizing with these people, and eventually drafting policy and helping organizations that actually do the most that they can do for these people.
100%. I think that you and I are both probably in solid agreement that this is probably. I mean, it kind of intersects with like economics and whatnot, but ultimately, fundamentally, I think it's a human issue because every human needs shelter.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a prioritization issue. It's if we wanted to put our resources towards this, then, we could this is an issue that we could solve. And that's why I thought it would be a good topic for this. And I'm glad we are talking about it, is because this is something, this isn't something like, how are we going to build civilization on Mars or something like that, that there's all these like crazy like ideas about, this is something that we have enough data to know what works. And this is something that we've been, some groups have been working towards for a while. Some groups and individuals have been working against, but so there's kind of a push and pull. But ultimately, this is something that if we put our minds to it, we can accomplish.
100%. And I think that another thing to talk about is sort of what this looks like in modern American politics. Um, he's he's no longer necessarily going to be the president, but the Trump administration fits pretty interestingly into this topic. So recently, Trump proposed cuts of $6.1 billion to like affordable housing programs, as well as like 8.6 billion to HUD, Housing and Urban Development
Oh wow,
organization.
I
Yeah,
didn't
yeah,
hear about
yeah.
that.
Oh, huge cuts. Um, and it's sort of begs the question of like why is this administration, which politically is it's not popular in the sense that a majority of the people believe in it, but it is popular in the sense that there is political momentum behind a lot of what Trump stands for,
Hmm.
and sort of it harkens back really to some really problematic stuff, and I think that this is indicative of a larger cultural problem. So after he had rescinded an Obama regulation that aimed to reduce housing discrimination, Trump said that the suburbs are like these beautiful places. People fight all their lives to get there, and he said, quote, "There will be no more low income housing forced into the suburbs. It's been going on for years. I've seen conflicts for years. It's been hell for suburbia." And that was in a talk, that was during a talk in Midland, Texas. And so I think that this is like it's sort of like this almost fetishization of suburbia, and this idea that like suburbia is like the peaceful place and it's the clean place, and low income housing is related to like seedy sort of things that aren't good, basically, sort of crime ridden, disease ridden, whatever, sort of just like an othering, going back to a topic that we talked about earlier,
Hmm.
that occurs with those that are struggling to find housing or that rely on subsidized housing or, yeah, subsidized housing.
Yeah, what's super interesting about this is, I actually looked into, like, why it is, well, this is related to this. I looked into why it is that we subsidize homeownership at such high rates, because the New York Times article that I was reading about the fact that we could, I think the title of the article was something along the lines of "We can solve homelessness right now if we want to," and it was advocating taking some or all of the money that we're using to subsidize homeownership and putting that towards HUD for vouchers, among a lot of other things. Building new houses so that they're more affordable, that sort of thing. But after reading that and reading about how much we subsidize homeownership, I got kind of curious about that, and I actually looked into this other article that details the history of the subsidization of homeownership, and it actually sort of began with this propaganda campaign promoted by the homeownership industry in early 1917, called the "Own Your Own Home" promotion, basically, which was exacerbated by the New Deal and the stock market crash and everything, and this idea that we need to rebuild the American dream. And the American dream was synonymous with owning a house. It wasn't synonymous with just having a roof over your head. It had to be owning a house. And so that was kind of the priority for so many Americans. And it all had to do with basically the the reason the homeownership industry lobbied for this, and advertised for this was basically to boost their own bottom line. They're going to make more money if more people are buying high-end apartments, and or not apartments, high-end houses. um, and if these houses are priced at high rates, if they're very, very valuable, then that's going to benefit the homeownership industry. And then also there was a lot of racism involved, because to apply for, before the 1968 Fair Housing Act, and even somewhat after that, but the act made it a little bit better, the FHA and the Veterans Administration mortgage programs largely only served white applicants, and they were able to just pick and choose who was able to get these tax cuts and vouchers and things like that. And obviously, because of the way generational wealth kind of works, we see the effects of that today. More white people own houses percentage wise than other races. And so it's kind of fascinating to think about, like, how this idea of the American dream being so closely related to homeownership, and then all these tax cuts and everything, it really has its roots in some in basically lobbying and marketing, in order to make people sort of think that way and then vote that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, sort of going off into what you were talking about, how, the FHA was providing loans, specifically, and the VA as well, after World War II, sort of in like the golden age of capitalism. That sort of gets into redlining, right? Where like you
Mhm.
had certain areas that were sort of designated as less valuable, which would mainly the reason why they were less valuable is because minorities lived in them. And this was a policy within the FHA until 1968, until we had the Fair Housing Act.
Mhm.
And I think that that was fueled a lot by sort of this otherization of certain minority groups moving into suburbia as well. And that there's sort of like a fear that like suburbia is going to be corrupted by, it's sort of like a dog whistle, right?
Mhm.
And what going back to the man who will not be president soon, Donald Trump. He tweeted at one point that the suburban housewife will be voting for me, that they want safety and are thrilled that I ended a long running program where low income housing would invade their neighborhood.
Yeah.
So, I mean, like, that's pretty dog whistly when you take into account the history of how segregated suburbia was,
Mhm.
and how, to a lesser extent, how segregated it is now. Because, like you said, wealth is passed on from generation to generation, and that is hugely affected by whether or not your parents owned property, right? That's the point I was trying to make.
Yep.
So, if you come from a line of homeowners going back 3 or 4 generations, the chances of you having better economic opportunity, not just from the money sort of made by selling whatever property your parents lived in, but also just because like if you live in an area with better housing and higher real estate prices, chances are your public school is a lot better and it's a lot better funded, and that provides you a social opportunity that a lot of people don't have. If you take that into consideration, yeah, there is sort of a racist element that sort of is against providing more accessible housing to people.
Yeah, definitely. And you definitely have a point there about the dog whistling about suburbia and these low income neighborhoods, and what exactly that means and everything. And I think that, going back to what we were talking about earlier, about how when these people actually get a chance to meet those who are in different income brackets and who have different lived experiences, hopefully that will sort of drive away some of the prejudice towards these groups. So I think that kind of has to be a big part of the solution here, is not having these, like, isolated groups of people that never get a chance to intercommunicate. It drives divide, it drives polarization, and it drives stereotyping, which it might be surprising to some people to find out that that there is still so much, covert and, even overt racism, in this country. But, like we've been saying, it's passes down over generations, and there's, the dog whistling makes it seem like it's not actually racism, even when it is. Pivoting to, slightly more optimistic aspect of this, we were talking about how, I went into a little bit about the fact that housing is so expensive in these cities, and that is kind of an obstacle to getting these housing first programs off the ground. And, um, in doing my research, I, definitely found some good news about, a more recent development, which, has gone viral. Some people might be kind of familiar with it, but, 3D printed housing is finally becoming a thing. There's this company called Icon, and there's a bunch of companies that are investing in this and building prototypes and things like that. But I believe the first successful one was, built in Austin, Texas in 2018, where, the base for the house was built in, like, 48 hours, and they built it on site. But I think they're also doing, or there's some of these that are also just, like, building them in factories and shipping them, and there's sort of pros and cons to doing it each way. But what's really cool is that, a lot of these houses, instead of costing, like, up to upwards of 400K and even higher, in highly regulated places like Los Angeles, these single unit houses can be built for anywhere between, like, 4K and 10,000, which is a monumental improvement. And considering, the, hundreds of thousands of individuals experiencing homelessness living in these cities that, especially when they're zoned for single family houses, I see this as kind of a revolutionary way to sort of address the problem of there not being enough affordable housing. And, the company I mentioned, Icon, is actually working with a charity called New Story, which, they're working together to build this project in El Salvador based on the prototype they built in Austin, Texas, where they're actually going to build an entire neighborhood of these 3D printed houses and give them away to people who are in need. And this is going to be kind of a testing ground for how, how effective this strategy can be in the future. And the hope is that, more nonprofits can get on board with this, and governments can start implementing solutions based on this. And eventually, this could be a huge step for, solving the problem, just getting more of these 3D printed houses built.
Yeah, I hadn't heard of this. I think I maybe saw like a 3D printed house like years ago. Like maybe it was that 2018 thing in Austin, Texas that you were talking about. But I feel like
Mhm,
this is also a huge benefit to providing housing to people who need it because it sort of helps to remove the rhetorical obstacle to basically any social welfare or aid, which is how are you going to pay for it? If we can now create houses that are 4,000, 6,000, $10,000 a piece that, I'm not sure like the quality of these houses or like how lavish they are. But even if it's just, like basic room, kitchen, bathroom, like bare minimum what a person needs to live, that's a great step forward.
mhm. Yeah, and way better than a shelter, like, regardless of it. And, they're made with at least the Icon ones are made with this new sort of material that they've built called Lavacrete, which, it's really cool. It can be, like, printed layer by layer. We'll drop a video in the description that sort of, showcases the process. It's actually really cool. And then, one of the, if you have extra money to go toward, any of the, several, organizations that are fighting homelessness, New Story would definitely be one of the more innovative ones. So we'll drop links for that in the show notes as well. One thing I forgot to mention, in the introduction, is that during every episode, we're going to be writing a whole show notes, thing, a whole page, basically, of everything we've been talking about, links to all of the articles that we're citing, and then, once we come up with, if we have sort of a list of plans of action, then we'll sort of list that in there as well. So you won't want to miss that. It'll be on our Medium page. Um, and yeah, so 3D printed housing, I believe it's going to be revolutionary. And one of the things that a lot of advocates and people who run shelters and things like that have talked about is just the need for revolutions like this to really reshape how housing development works. And so that's another hope that I have is that that continues to be innovated on in the near future and becomes a primary way of sort of countering this issue.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know if I have anything to add to that.
Yeah. Cool. Another thing I had written down here is when I was thinking about the high cost of housing, obviously the 3D printed houses are going to help, but that's not going to be for a while. But something that got me thinking about this recently, as someone who works from home and, considering that we don't know exactly how long COVID's going to last, and, this is already kind of transformed how the job market operates, and a lot of companies have reoriented toward this new reality. One thing I've been thinking about is, well, why is it so expensive to live in the city? And part of the reason, of course, is because this is where all of the tech companies are, this is where all of the wealthy people sort of, end up moving to, and then, consolidating in these places and gentrifying these places. And then this becomes the hub where everything is, where you have to be in order to find a job and things like that. And so thinking about how COVID has affected all this, it has me thinking, you don't necessarily need to live in the city anymore to work a lot of different jobs, especially more technical jobs and more design oriented jobs and things that can be done behind a computer. So thinking about how the job market has changed, that has me thinking that that could be a solution in and of itself. Just embracing working from home so that people aren't so consolidated in these cities. We can spread out the housing developments that we build using these government funds for people experiencing homelessness, and that'll it'll drive down the prices. And yeah, and I think that's a good thing to start thinking about, if you're someone who owns a business, if you're someone who works somewhere that could operate on a working from home basis. But, yeah, what do you think about that, Grant?
Yeah, if you have a group of people who maybe they'd have to drive to their quote unquote place of work like once a month or every other week or whatever, then that gives them a lot more um, liberty to sort of move away from areas where the cost of housing is so high, which would probably affect the overall price of housing within those previously more expensive areas like in metropolitan sort of urban areas.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that that could be a huge shift, and it'll be interesting to see if in the future, right now we have areas that are pretty divided between like this is urban and this is suburban, this is rural, and it'll be interesting to see like as internet coverage becomes better nationwide, then hopefully things will start to spread out and blend a little bit more, and then there'll be less polarization. And we'll see where that goes. Maybe we should be cautiously optimistic as opposed to just completely optimistic. But at the very least, it's gonna be a trade-off for people who prefer that office environment. But I think it could go a long way towards decreasing the prices for housing, and hopefully moving towards a world where not everything is so consolidated into highly densely populated cities, and there's more kind of wealth to go around, more opportunities to go around. I think that could really do a lot for the unhoused population. in terms of having places to go, because I'm pretty sure more than half, if not a lot more than half, of people experiencing homelessness are in these major cities. So, being able to spread out the resources could, I think, go a long way.
I absolutely agree. Spreading resources is a good idea, everybody. You heard it here first.
Absolutely.
Solution to all problems, spread the wealth.
Yep.
Yep.
I think we're done with the whole podcast now. We just uncovered the solution to
Yeah, this
everything.
is the first and last episode. Get all the wealth, give everybody the same amount of wealth, and this isn't communism, but maybe we just try this a little bit.
Don't
You know,
don't worry, Grandpa. This isn't communism.
nobody call HUAC on me, please. I've been a good boy. I swear. I love my country. I love bald eagle and American striped flag. I don't do anything bad. I promise.
um, So I think we're about ready to wrap this up. We talked about a lot of things. It seems like we were, sort of to go back to the beginning, we were in agreement about housing first being a really phenomenal policy, especially compared to, the policy of just, giving these people one thing at a time, and then afterwards giving them housing. People need housing to give themselves a stable foundation in order for them to be in a mentally healthy place, and then get themselves on their feet. It's been proven effective in many countries, including our own. And in order to effectively implement a housing first model, we need houses and apartments that are, decently priced, so that we have the money to afford this, and the money to build these housing developments. Zoning plays a huge role in this. A lot of cities are still zoned for single family homes instead of multifamily homes and apartments and things like that, due to the propaganda campaigns that we talked about, and just the history of the American dream, and the way that people view housing in the United States, and as well as the NIMBY stuff that you brought up about, people not wanting lower income housing next to them, and sort of the, like, racism and bigotry and just the prejudice that comes with that. Um, and so that because of that, a lot of this is related to a cultural shift that needs to take place in order for this to work. We need to, when we see these people on the streets, we need to not constantly walk by and ignore them, but greet them with a smile. And even something as simple as that can help their lives be a lot better, and decrease the hostility between all of us, and help us learn a little bit more about their situations. Um, we've also linked some videos where you can learn about the experience of being homeless, and we talked about how the media plays a role in how people view this sort of thing. And um, additionally, I'd like to bring up something that we kind of touched on briefly when we were talking about 3D printed housing. There's a lot of places you can donate to if you have some extra money. News Story is a great organization that's really revolutionizing things with, they've actually been doing housing for a while, but specifically with this partnership with Icon focusing on this 3D printed housing, I think it's going to be a real game changer. And we'll see, this El Salvador project is going to give us a lot of data about how this can work. And but I'd also recommend going into your checking out your local homeless shelters, and donating and volunteering and seeing what items they need. A lot of times these organizations need just things like blankets and canned food and things like that, and these things really go a long way. And ultimately, it's about building a community. There's also Wound Walk and OC, which I'll link to, which is a group that I saw featured on the Invisible People channel, which is sort of going around and providing, things like these, hygiene kits and medicine and stuff like that for people on the streets, where disease tends to run rampant. So ultimately, there is a lot you can do, which I would say means we, have made a pretty successful podcast episode, and a pretty convincing case for all this. I don't know. What would you say, Grant?
Yeah, I would definitely agree. And I think that what's most important to keynote here is that both of our approaches are sort of the primary function of our policy ideas are is to literally fix homelessness, not sort of make homelessness decrease through sort of tangential or unrelated economic or social policies, but primarily making sure that those that need housing get housing. Because I think if that's the primary objective that human need, I think that that sets us on the right track of actually solving the issue.
Absolutely. And we talk a lot about how the numbers in certain areas have increased and decreased, but really the number that we should be striving for all around the world, really, but in the United States also, where we can make a difference, is zero. The number should be zero of people who have to live on the streets or in shelters. And I think that we've kind of showcased how we can actually make that happen. This is not just some utopia that could exist in the far future, but this is something that we can make actionable steps toward. So please check out all of the links in the show notes, and hopefully we can all make a difference if we all join together. If you want to hear more of our podcast, you can check us out on Spotify and on Apple Podcasts and on wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow our blog where we put all the show notes at medium.com/solutions. And you can follow us on all social media. Look us up, Solutions, on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. And if you have any suggestions about ideas you want us to talk about in future episodes, we're open to pretty much any idea as long as there are actionable solutions to solve it. And please let us know what you thought about all of this. We are dedicated to making this a an effective podcast that really makes its mark on the world and changes people's perspectives and drives people to action. So, and we um, could use all of the support that we can get with this goal. So, thank you all for listening, and we'll see you in the next one.
Take care, everyone.